A few days ago, China released its 2023 edition of what's known as the Standard Map. But this isn't your average map. It's creating quite a stir on the international stage. This new map showed Indian territories as part of China's sovereign territory, specifically AngloChin and Arunachal Pradesh. Beijing claimed these areas as their own, and India responded with a strong rebuttal. But this isn't just about China and India. The controversy has snowballed, with most stakeholders getting involved. China's neighbors, including the Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Vietnam, have all lodged strong protests against this map. So why are they so angry? To kick things off, let's take a closer look at this controversial map that China just published. The map features something called the 9-dash line, a concept that has no legal basis. This line is essentially China's way of laying claim to vast stretches of territory, including parts of Russia, India, and even Taiwan. As you can see, this line stretches across the South China Sea, encompassing an enormous area. But here's the twist. China has now added an extra dash to the east of Taiwan, implying that Taiwan is part of China's territory. This move has set off alarm bells worldwide, and rightfully so. India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, called China's claims absurd and said, "This is an old habit of theirs. It is not something which is new. Making absurd claims does not make other people's territories yours." While the Philippines stated that the map has no basis under international law, Malaysia too dismissed China's claims, maintaining its stance of rejecting any foreign party's sovereignty claims over its maritime features. The international community is not mincing words when it comes to criticizing China's actions. This map is undeniably causing a diplomatic storm. Now let's hear what China has to say in its defense. China argues that this map is a routine practice, something they do regularly, and it's in line with their exercise of sovereignty. They want everyone to view the matter objectively and calmly and avoid overinterpretation. The timing of this map's release is interesting, given that the G20 summit is just around the corner. Is China trying to set the stage for discussions at the summit, or is there a more straightforward explanation? To better grasp what's happening now, let's look at the history between India and China. First, be sure to hit the like button. A video pointing out CCP's mistake is most definitely going to get downvoted by CCP bots, so your likes help us a lot with the algorithm. In the late 19th century, the world was undergoing profound changes, and the balance of power was shifting. This is when the Anglo-Chinese Convention of 1890 came into play. It was a very important event in the history of how China and Britain interacted. This convention was signed on September 20th, 1890 in Beijing, and had a big impact on both countries and how much control they had in East Asia. Before this, in the mid-19th century, China had lost in the Opium Wars, which were really embarrassing. This led to a bunch of unfair deals with Western countries, especially the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. These deals gave foreign people special rights in China and gave away parts of China to Western countries. Around the same time, as countries were trying to grab land in Africa, they were also trying to do the same thing in East Asia. Britain wanted to make sure it didn't lose its power in China and tried to stop other countries from taking over. One of the central provisions of the convention was the establishment of a demarcation line. This line extended from the mouth of the Irrawaddy River in Burma, now Myanmar, to the mountains of Tibet, effectively dividing British-controlled Burma and Chinese-controlled Tibet. The convention reaffirmed China's sovereignty over Tibet while recognizing British influence and control in Burma. It marked a significant departure from previous agreements, as it acknowledged China's authority in Tibet. Crucially, the convention included a promise of non-interference in Tibet by both Britain and China, seeking to maintain the status quo and preserve stability in the region. For Britain, the convention helped consolidate its control over Burma, securing its strategic interest in Southeast Asia. It also provided a framework for maintaining influence in Tibet. China, on the other hand, saw the convention as a diplomatic victory, as it reaffirmed its sovereignty over Tibet. This recognition bolstered China's prestige and authority on the international stage. However, the convention also contributed to Tibet's isolation from the rest of the world. The promise of non-interference meant that Tibet was left to its own devices, which had both positive and negative consequences for the region. These provisions, while seemingly straightforward, would set the stage for future conflicts and debates. At the turn of the 20th century, the British Empire was at its highest point in India. Meanwhile, Russia was expanding its influence in Central Asia, sparking the Great Game for supremacy in the region. The British aimed to secure their northern frontier, aka Arunachal Pradesh, and maintain their control over the Indian subcontinent. Tibet, a remote and mysterious region, had traditionally maintained its independence under the spiritual and temporal authority of the Dalai Lama. It had little direct contact with the outside world, but that was about to change. In 1914, amidst World War II, a conference was convened in Simla, a picturesque hill station in British India. The participants included representatives from Britain, Tibet, and China. Sir Henry McMahon represented the British, while the Tibetans were led by Lachlan Satra and the Chinese by Ivan Chen. The primary focus of the conference was to define the boundary between British India and Tibet. A series of maps were drawn, outlining the proposed borders. The McMahon Line, named after the British representative, played a central role in these discussions. On July 3, 1914, the Simla Accord was signed by the British and Tibetan representatives, marking an agreement on the McMahon Line as the boundary between British India and Tibet. However, the Chinese representative refused to sign, and ambiguities in the accord would haunt the region for decades. The outbreak of World War I overshadowed the Simla Accord, diverting global attention. The British, preoccupied with the war, failed to enforce the accord, leading to its virtual abandonment. The McMahon Line, established during the Simla Accord, will become a source of dispute between India and China, leading to the Sino-Indian War of 1962. The legacy of this accord continues to influence geopolitics in the region. The validity of the McMahon Line is a matter of international law. Some legal experts argue that the line is valid because it was signed by the Tibetan government, which at the time, an independent state. Others argue that the line is invalid because China was not a party to the Simla Agreement and because the Tibetan government did not have the authority to cede territory to British India. In 1947, India gained independence from British colonial rule, and in 1949, the People's Republic of China was established under Chairman Mao Zedong. These two neighboring nations, both freshly independent and navigating their post-colonial past, were about to face a series of challenges along their shared border. The border between India and China was not clearly defined in many areas. The McMahon Line came back, haunting both nations. Along with the McMahon Line, another disputed area was Aksai Chin, a high-altitude desert region that both India and China claimed. The first major conflict erupted in 1947 in the eastern sector of the India-China border, particularly in the regions of Taiwan and NEFA, Northeast Frontier Agency, now Arunachal Pradesh. The conflict began when an Indian patrol team encountered a Chinese patrol team in an area that both countries claimed as their own. The two teams exchanged words, and eventually the Indian team demanded that the Chinese team turn back. The Chinese team refused, and the two teams faced off, each with their weapons drawn. In the midst of escalating tensions, both India and China engaged in negotiations to resolve their border disputes. Various meetings and discussions took place, but no concrete solution was reached during 1947 to 1948. In the wake of World War II, China was undergoing radical changes. The Chinese Civil War raged, with the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, emerging victorious in 1949. This marked the beginning of the People's Republic of China. In 1949, as the Chinese Civil War ended, a Tibetan delegation arrived in Beijing to discuss their nation's status, seeking recognition and peaceful coexistence with the new communist regime. The talks seemed promising, but behind the scenes, geopolitical ambitions were at play. China saw Tibet as a vital piece in its vision of a united communist China. In October 1950, the Chinese PLA, without a formal declaration of war, began massing troops at the Tibetan border. The Dalai Lama, Tibetan's spiritual and temporal leader, faced an agonizing decision. The Dalai Lama, after extensive deliberations, decided to sign the 17-point agreement, effectively recognizing Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. However, it is widely debated whether this agreement was signed under duress, with a threat of military force looming large. The Chinese invasion led to the occupation of Tibet. Chinese troops entered Lhasa, the capital, and Tibetan resistance was crushed. Tibetan culture, religion, and way of life faced radical transformations. The same year, India recognized Tibet as an autonomous region of China. This diplomatic move further complicated the India-China relationship. India was concerned about the Chinese invasion of Tibet for several reasons. First, Tibet has been a buffer state between India and China, and its occupation by China would give China a strategic advantage. Second, India had a long history of cultural and religious ties to Tibet, and the Chinese invasion was seen as a threat to those ties. Third, India feared that the Chinese invasion would set a precedent for China to invade other countries in the region. The Indian government's response to the Chinese invasion was complex and difficult. On the one hand, India wanted to avoid a military conflict with China, which would have been costly and dangerous. On the other hand, India wanted to protect its interests in Tibet and the region. Ultimately, the Indian government decided to take a cautious approach, hoping that China would eventually withdraw from Tibet. However, China did not withdraw from Tibet, and the border dispute between India and China remained unresolved. On November 20th, 1950, the Chinese government announced a ceasefire and put a temporary halt to hostilities in the ongoing China-India border conflict. Several factors prompted this ceasefire. First, the Chinese military was making rapid gains in the eastern sector of the conflict, and it was clear that India was in danger of losing large amount of territory. Second, the United States was considering providing military assistance to India, which would have put China in a difficult position. Third, the Chinese government was eager to improve its international image, and a ceasefire would help to do that. The ceasefire agreement called for both sides to withdraw their troops to positions 20 kilometers behind the line of actual control. The ceasefire agreement was not a permanent solution to the China-India border conflict. However, it did help to reduce tensions between the two countries and allow for further negotiations. Both countries have had several talks since the ceasefire, but no agreement has been reached on the border issue. In the spirit of cooperation, both India and China participated in the Asian Relations Conference in 1947 and the Bandung Conference in 1955. However, the seeds of their collaboration were sown earlier. In 1954, Nehru's historic visit to China laid the foundation for the Panchen Agreement. At its core were the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. The first principle emphasized the recognition of each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. This laid the foundation for resolving border disputes through peaceful means. The second principle, mutual non-aggression, committed both countries to refrain from the use of force and military aggression in their dealings with each other. The third principle called for non-interference in each other's internal affairs, respecting the principles of self-determination and non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. The fourth principle emphasized equality and mutual benefit in all aspects of their relations, including trade, economic cooperation, and cultural exchanges. The fifth and final principle was the commitment to peaceful coexistence, emphasizing the importance of diplomacy, dialogue, and peaceful resolution of conflicts. On April 29, 1954 in Beijing, Prime Minister Nehru and Premier Zhou Enlai signed the Panchen Agreement, solidifying their commitment to these principles. The Panchen Agreement held immense significance. It marked the beginning of India-China cooperation and their commitment to resolving disputes through peaceful means. However, there are a number of reasons why the Panchen Agreement had not been effective in preventing border conflicts. One reason is that the agreement is vague and open to interpretation. For example, the principle of mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty is not clear about what constitutes a violation of sovereignty. This has led to disagreements between India and China about where the border lies. Another reason for the ineffectiveness of the Panchen Agreement is that the two countries have different political systems and strategic interests. India is a democracy, while China is a communist country. China has a strategic interest in maintaining a balance of power in Asia, while China has a strategic interest in expanding its influence. These different interests have made it difficult for the two countries to reach a mutually agreeable solution to the border dispute. Now let's fast forward to 1959, March 10th to be precise. This day marked a pivotal moment in Tibetan history. Tibetans rose up against Chinese rule, and the Dalai Lama, at great personal risk, fled the Tibetan capital, Lhasa. His escape was fraught with danger as he traversed the treacherous Himalayan mountains. The Dalai Lama's journey to India was a daring escape that captured the world's attention. He crossed the border into India on March 31, 1959, where he was welcomed with open arms by then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. Dalai Lama eventually sought asylum in the Indian town of Dharamshala. Nations around the world expressed support for him and condemned China's actions in Tibet. The United Nations took up the matter, but little concrete action was taken. So how did this impact Sino-Indian relations? Well, it further strained an already fragile relationship. India, which had initially recognized Tibet as an autonomous region within China, was now providing refuge to the Dalai Lama, essentially recognizing him as the Tibetan leader in exile. The Dalai Lama's presence in India also had a lasting impact. Dharamshala became the headquarters of the Tibetan government in exile, and the Tibetan diaspora continues to thrive there today. This event further cemented India's position as a refuge for Tibetans fleeing Chinese rule. China was furious about India's stance and viewed it as a betrayal. This event soured diplomatic ties, leading to a series of skirmishes along the disrupted Sino-Indian border in 1959 and eventually the SinoIndian War in 1962. Both nations kept proposing diplomatic solutions between 1960 and 1962. However, none of these efforts bore fruit. In response, India implemented the forward policy, establishing advanced posts in disputed areas and seeking military aid from the West, which was initially denied by the US. Ironically, this led India to turn to the Soviets for military assistance, as the US thought they were too soft on communism. This shift in reliances would prove significant. Meanwhile, in China, Chairman Mao Zedong stated, "Nero wants to move forward and we won't let him." The stage was set for a confrontation. The Chinese chose their moment wisely, launching attacks in both eastern and western border regions on October 20th, 1962. China had a much larger army than India, with over 800,000 soldiers compared to India's 400,000. China also had more advanced weapons, including tanks and artillery. With India ill-prepared and undermanned, Chinese forces made significant advances. The Indian Western Command withdrew many isolated outposts. In the east, the Chinese surprised the Indian forces by fording the Namkachu River, catching them off guard. The Indian troops withdrew into Bhutan. As the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded, the world's attention was diverted, allowing the Chinese to press their advantage. Thousands of Chinese troops attacked Indian positions, leading to further territorial gains. The Indian government was caught off guard by the attack and was unable to mount an effective defense. The war took a heavy toll on both sides, with thousands of casualties and prisoners of war. The harsh winter conditions in the Himalayas added to the challenges faced by both armies. Negotiations stalled repeatedly, and India declared a national emergency. The US and UK supported India, shipping military aid. Fighting resumed in November, but it became clear that the Chinese were prepared to withdraw to the original control lines. Finally, on November 19, 1962, a unilateral ceasefire was declared, marking the end of the SinoIndian War. China captured a large swath of territory from India, including the entire Aksai Chin region. The war was a major humiliation for India. Diplomatic ties were severed, and mistrust lingered for years. India embarked on military modernization and nuclear development. The war also strained India's relationship with Pakistan. 2.5 decades later, in 1987, tensions flared again. This time, it was in the remote region of Samdurong-Chu in Arunachal Pradesh. The standoff was triggered by a Chinese construction project to build a helipad and other infrastructure in the Samdurong-Chu Valley, which India viewed as an incursion into its territory. This area is strategically important because it lies near the tri-junction of India, China, and Bhutan. The Indian government saw China's activities as an attempt to strengthen its position in the region. The skirmish was fierce but non-lethal. Both sides used their fists and makeshift weapons, avoiding fatalities but sending a clear message. The situation escalated, with both sides sending troops and increasing their military presence in the area. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi initiated diplomatic efforts to prevent further escalation. Diplomats from both countries met in Beijing to discuss a peaceful resolution, avoiding an all-out conflict. Eventually, after weeks of intense negotiations, both sides agreed to withdraw their troops from the valley, avoiding a full-scale war. During the early 1990s, India and China encountered a critical juncture in their bilateral ties, especially concerning their contested border regions. Over the years, intermittent disputes had ignited military clashes and prolonged standoffs. In a bid to avert further escalation and foster harmonious coexistence, both nations initiated a diplomatic endeavor that ultimately led to the ratification of the Agreement on Maintaining Peace and Serenity along the line of actual control in the India-China border regions in September 1993. The agreement consists of 9 articles, which outline the following commitments by the two countries. To maintain the status quo along the line of actual control, LAC, pending a final settlement of the boundary question. To reduce their military forces along the LAC to minimum levels compatible with friendly and good neighborly relations. To refrain from conducting any military exercises involving more than one division in close proximity to the LAC. To notify each other of military exercises involving more than one brigade along the LAC. To establish a working mechanism for consultation and coordination on border affairs. To resolve any disputes arising out of the implementation of the agreement through peaceful means. The 1993 agreement was a significant step forward in the India-China relationship. The agreement also helped to reduce tensions between the two countries, which had been high in the wake of the 1962 Sino-Indian War. While the 1993 agreement marked a significant milestone in Sino-Indian relations, it faced challenges in implementation. Border incidents and disputes continued to arise, particularly in the western sector. The differing perceptions of the LAC and unresolved territorial claims remain contentious issues. The 1993 agreement is still in force today. However, there are some challenges to its implementation. One challenge is that the agreement does not define the LAC precisely. This has led to some ambiguity about where the border actually lies. Another challenge is that the agreement does not address the issue of the disputed Aksai-Chin region. As the world transitioned from the Cold War era to a new global order, the year 1996 bore witness to geopolitical shifts and emerging security challenges. Nations were grappling with the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which had given rise to new regional dynamics and threats. In this turbulent environment, many nations sought to reduce tensions and avoid the escalation of conflicts through confidence-building measures. But what exactly are confidence-building measures? In essence, CBMs are diplomatic, military, or political actions taken by states to build trust, reduce misunderstandings, and prevent unintended escalations. CBMs can take various forms, from arms control agreements to crisis communication mechanisms and transparency measures. In 1996, various regions across the globe witnessed the adoption of confidence-building measures, CBMs, as a strategy to tackle distinct security issues and foster peace. Notably, India and China jointly embraced a series of CBMs aimed at averting miscommunications and diminishing the potential for armed conflicts along the line of actual control, LAC. One of the most critical CBMs was the establishment of a Joint Working Group, JWG, to discuss border issues. The JWG played a vital role in building trust and facilitating dialogue between the two nations. So what was the impact of these CBMs on the ground? The measures succeeded in reducing the number of border incidents and ensuring smoother communication between India and China. 2013, the Dbo Standoff. 1.5 decades later, on April 15, 2013, around 40 soldiers of the People's Liberation Army of China intruded into Indian territory for about 20 kilometers in the Dulad Beg Oldi, DBO area of Ladakh. Dulad Beg Oldi, DBO, is a historic campsite which is located on the ancient trade route passing through India and Tibet. It connects Ladakh to the Tarim Basin in Xinjiang province in western China. DBO is an important military base of the Indian Army. As the vast tract of the area is uninhabited, the Chinese troops set up their tents with ease and without being noticed. When Indian patrol teams found the tents, they objected to Chinese presence on Indian soil, but the PLA soldiers refused to back off. The Indo-Tibetan Border Police troops were ordered to march to the site. An equal number of ITBP soldiers put up their tents some 300 meters from the Chinese troops. China kept saying that its troops were on its side of the border. India contested their claim. The diplomatic channels were opened up and negotiators talked at length. Ministry of External Affairs officials got in touch with their Chinese counterparts. The then Indian ambassador to China S. Shashankar visited the Chinese Foreign Office in Beijing twice. Finally, a series of flag meetings between the local commanders from the two sides took place, and after 3 weeks, the Dulad Beg Oldi standoff was resolved. 2013, Shumar Standoff. Hours after Chinese troops pulled back from the Dulad Beg Oldi, they came back in Shumar area in Ladakh. This time, the local patrol team said that some 300 PLA troops were camping in Shumar. Chinese troops came there objecting to tin shed structures put by the Indian forces. Chinese troops said that as per the deal agreed during the last standoff, India had to dismantle the tin sheds, which PLA termed as bunkers. Shumar is the last village in Ladakh area of Jammu and Kashmir bordering Himachal Pradesh. Shumar has been a bone of contention between India and China, with the latter claiming it to be its own territory. Chinese troops have been foraying into this border area with their helicopters almost every year. This time, their troops raised tents on the ground. Hectic diplomatic parleys began once again. S. Shankar again played a key role in restoring the status quo. Chinese Premier Li Qingshan was scheduled to visit on May 19th to India that year. In the view of his visit, diplomatic deliberations yielded results. Chinese troops dismantled their tents on May 5th, and then the Indian forces removed their tin sheds. Flag meetings were held on May 6th, and the Shumar standoff was resolved in 21 days, with China agreeing to patrolling by the Indian troops in the area as before. 2014, Demchok Standoff. Demchok Standoff began on September 10, 2014, as Indian patrol teams discovered that the Chinese troops had deployed heavy machinery to build a road inside Indian territory. Objecting to it, Indian forces moved and camped opposite Chinese troops. Demchok is located in the same Shumar area. According to the 2011 census of India, Demchok has 31 households with a total population of 78 persons. But China claims that Demchok is part of the autonomous Tibet region. The Demchok standoff continued even when Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping signed 12 deals on September 18th. it was apparent that Modi had discussed the issue with Jinping, who was said to have shown discomfort regarding the Chinese forces' incursion. Jinping reportedly provided assurances to Modi during their talks, which subsequently led to the resolution of the Dbo Standoff, but it took another week for the Chinese forces to withdraw, which followed a meeting between External Affairs Minister Sun Shoare and her Chinese counterpart in New York on September 26. Finally, after 20 days, PLA troops withdrew to their pre-September 10th position. 2017. Doklam Standoff. The Doklam Standoff began on June 16, 2017, 10 days after Bhutan objected to Chinese road construction in the disputed area. Doklam Plateau is a disputed area between Bhutan and China. The two countries had held 24 rounds of talks for finding a resolution to border disputes in 3 pockets, including Doklam. After Bhutan requested the Indian Army, the troops reached the site of road construction and stopped the Chinese activity. This led to soldiers jostling with each other. They were seen pushing each other in a widely circulated video. Soon, the troops from both the sides took their positions nearly 150 meters from each other at Doklam. While China kept demanding that India must withdraw the troops unconditionally and acknowledge Chinese sovereignty over Doklam, MEA officials launched diplomatic efforts to prevent the escalation of the standoff. High-level contacts were also established, with National Security Advisor Ajit Doval holding a meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping during their former's Beijing visit in July. With international support growing in India's favor and the BRICS summit approaching fast, the Chinese side agreed to resolve the standoff. Both sides disengaged at Doklam by pulling out troops. China also agreed to stop road construction, at least for the time being, in the disputed Doklam area. Finally, after 70 days of eyeball encounter, India and Chinese troops returned to their pre-June 16 positions. 2020. The Galwan Valley Clash. The Galwan Valley clash during the year overshadowed all previous incidents, emerging as a significantly more significant and critical development. The Galwan Valley, located in the Ladakh region of India, is a strategically significant area for both India and China. It serves as a disputed border, and tensions have been simmering for months. Tensions have been building along the line of actual control, LAC, for months, with skirmishes and face-offs becoming more frequent. Diplomatic talks were underway, but a resolution remained elusive. On the night of June 15, 2020, a violent confrontation erupted between India and Chinese troops in the Galwan Valley. It began when Indian soldiers attempted to dismantle a Chinese encampment. The battle was brutal and fierce, fought with fists, rocks, and improvised weapons. The extreme altitude and harsh terrain added to the challenges faced by both sides. The confrontation resulted in numerous casualties on both sides, with India confirming the loss of 20 soldiers in combat, while China acknowledged casualties without disclosing specific figures. Interestingly, the Russian news agency, TASS, reported a significantly higher number, stating that 45 Chinese soldiers had died. In the aftermath of the violent clash, both countries engaged in diplomatic talks and negotiations to de-escalate the situation. Eventually, a disengagement process was agreed upon, leading to the withdrawal of troops from certain flashpoints along the LAC. By August 2022, after multiple rounds of talks, the two nations met once again for their 15 rounds of talks. While there was a sense of déjà vu, there was also an understanding that both sides needed to continue the dialogue. China's border disputes extended beyond India. It's worth noting that China shares its borders with 15 neighboring countries, and it might come as a surprise that it has border disputes with 14 out of those 15 neighbors. Apart from India, the most significant disputes are with Russia. China claims the Russian-controlled territory of the Argun River and the Ussuri River. Vietnam. China claims the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands. Japan. China claims the Senkaku Islands. Mongolia. China claims a small area of territory in the north of Mongolia. The CCP's expansion mindset is rooted in its ideology of Chinese nationalism. This ideology holds that China is a great power that has been humiliated by foreign powers in the past. The CCP believes that it's its mission to restore China to its rightful place as a leading power in the world. The CCP's expansionistic policies are also motivated by its desire to secure natural resources and strategic territory. China is a rapidly growing economy that requires access to natural resources such as oil, gas, and minerals. It also wants to control key strategic waterways such as the South China Sea. There is no agreement on whether China wants to expand its territory. Some people say that China's border disputes are just old problems and that China does not want to use force to solve them. Others say that China's recent actions, such as publishing a new map that includes disputed territory, show that China wants to expand. The new map is part of China's efforts to claim disputed territory. China has also increased its military presence in the South China Sea and has conducted aggressive maritime patrols. These actions have made some people worry that China is trying to expand its power in the region. It is possible that China will use the map to justify further militarization of the South China Sea. It is also possible that the map will lead to increased tensions between China and its neighbors. The future of the South China Sea remains uncertain, but the new map is a sign that China is willing to take a more assertive approach to its territorial claims.